Welcome everyone to the Starting Point Education channel. I am Loretta Depka and I am happy again to be hosting Pat Obst. And tonight's topic is loss of a loved one, a child loss part one, which is Ricky's story. So Pat is going to share with us her very personal story. And it's a very different kind of podcast that we're doing. Pat will be sharing about her loss as a mom and how that experience changed her life. She also will be sharing wisdom and inspiration from that experience that all grieving parents can relate to, find comfort in, heal through, and grow from. So Pat, I didn't introduce you because we've done a number of these grief and loss series, but this one is special and very different. So I'm going to turn it over to you at this point.
So for tonight's podcast, I decided to share Ricky's story because every parent has their own very unique story about the life and the loss of their child. So I'm going to start by reading actually a poem that was read at my son Ricky's funeral. It was written by my partner. I just want to share that to start out with. It says, for baby Ricky, it's called We Knew You for a Moment. And some of you who've been at my office may have seen the plaque that is at my doorway. It has Ricky's name on it, and in quotes it says, we knew you for a moment. And that came from this poem. We knew you for a moment. You came and then were gone. Your face was like an angel's. Your heart, it beat so strong. We had so much to give you. We had so much to say. We knew you for a moment, and then you went away. We miss you as we grieve now. We feel you move no more. Our hearts are oh so broken. We've cried and beat the floor. We've asked a million questions. We've shouted at the sky. We've sobbed at all the memories and can't stop asking why. We loved you from the instant you took shape in our hearts, before you came to us and left us torn apart. Your face was like an angel's. We wanted you to stay. We knew you for a moment, but then you went away. We look within our hearts now and try to heal our pain. We know that someday we will see your angel face again. You blessed our life so fully, so briefly, yet so much, and only but an angel could have that powerful touch. For life for you was measured not in hours or in days, but how you somehow changed our hearts in deep and profound ways. Your face was like an angel's, a beautiful, sweet treasure. We knew you for a moment, but love you forever. And Ricky was only 32 and a half hours he lived, but all of us here who've lost a child, for you, I'm sure it also feels like you only knew your child for a moment, because anytime our child goes before us, right, it's way too soon. So that poem really applies to all of us. So, some of you who are my clients here, bits and pieces of my story. I'm sharing the details because, the context in which the birth, the life, and the death of our children happened is really important. Our stories, they shed the light on the depth of the connection that we have with our children, the impact of their life and their death, and our continued connection with them on us as we travel along what I call our afterwards journey. And if you've seen my site, that's what that's called, the afterwards journey. So I was a therapist for several years before the loss of my infant son, Ricky. After that loss, I became a grief counselor, and I specialized in working with parents who've lost children because I understood the pain. So I often say that, I've been through the long, dark, winding tunnel, when a new parent comes to me, and I encourage them that I have the lantern to show them the way because I've been through that dark tunnel, and I can help them to find healing and even joy again. So tonight, in sharing the details of Ricky's story, I'm also going to be sharing some ways that parents can kind of actively grieve and heal begin to heal through this tremendous loss. So today, I don't know if everybody knows, but today is Ricky's birthday. He would be 20 years old today, which is a pretty monumental age. And when I think 20 years ago, it's pretty incredible that it was that long ago. It was difficult to work on this podcast, even though it was 20 years ago, because the journey never ends. Our grief journey never ends. And so this is part of my continued healing and the continuation of Ricky's legacy. So Ricky's story began long before his birth. I went through a divorce and a miscarriage years before. I was going 100 miles an hour towards motherhood, and then that came crashing down. Later on, after I met my partner, I had 2 stepchildren, and that gave me somewhere for that mothering to go. Because I think all the mothers on this podcast, and if there are any fathers listening, you're sort of in that zone to be a parent. And so I was able to release some of that with my stepchildren, but I still longed to have my own child. So I got my master's in social work, then my license, and then my clinical license, so that I could eventually be a therapist and stay home with my child. Then I went through the process of fertility, finding a donor, fertility testing, treatments, procedures, all that. And some of you may have gone through that as well. And that has some losses of its own along that process. After 5 tries, finally on the 6th try in December of 2001, I found out that I was pregnant. Of course, I was elated at that. And I had a few complications and scares, but nothing major. And so we moved on. I was sick as a dog. I don't know if any other mothers on here were sick, but I didn't have morning sickness. I had all day and night sickness. But Ricky was a feisty little guy. I had an ultrasound, and it took a while because he kept moving. And at one point, the ultrasound technician said, "He's actually stomping on your bladder." I said, "I know." Because he was so tiny, and he was mad. Like, he must have wanted to take a nap or something, but he was stomping on my bladder. So, there was joy. There was so much joy in that process. Then May came. And May is actually my grief season. Even up to this year. When May comes, I get in a funk. And that is something that you'll all find, that there's this season, like for me, it's that coming into spring, because that is when I started to spot, and I was only 23 weeks along, which all of you know is not long enough. It's only about half baked. I didn't want to believe that something bad was happening. I didn't go to the doctor until the next morning. And as all of you, I'm sure, have experienced, you say, "Oh, maybe I should have, if only I would have," right? And different podcasts, we'll talk about forgiveness later. But I did finally, come to a forgiveness around that. But when I went to see the doctor, his face was like no face I had ever seen. Went completely white and serious. He said, "You're dilated 3 centimeters. I can see his hair. You need to go directly to the emergency room." I had to drive there by myself and go to the ER, sit there by myself, then be taken by wheelchair, whisked away to a room and get hooked up to all kinds of monitors by myself. They put me on what's called magnesium sulfate, which is a major muscle relaxant to stop any contractions. And after about 3 days was the first time that I almost died. I know what it feels like to drown, because what happens is it relaxes you so much that it doesn't process all the fluid in your body, and my lungs are beginning to fill up. And the doctor actually sat on the edge of my bed and said, "If Ricky comes now, he probably won't live. Do we save you, or do we try to save him?" And she actually said that to me. I had to make that choice. I had 2 stepchildren. So I said, save me. So they stopped the magnesium sulfate, and miraculously, I didn't go back into labor. So we thought, okay, we have a reprieve here. After the doctors did some tests, they constantly monitored me and tested me. The doctor came in and said, you will need to be here for the duration of your pregnancy. This was May. Ricky wasn't due until June. I was going to have to stay in the hospital for months. And in what they call Trendelenburg position, which is it's slanted so that gravity is working for you to hold the baby in. I made good friends with the bedpan because I couldn't get out of bed for anything. So meanwhile, they had given Ricky a steroid shot to help his lungs develop quickly. So we just settled in. I was stuck in this bed in this room. I had 2 tray tables on either side of me. And I had a grabber. I don't know if anybody has ever used that in the hospital, where has a little trigger to it and it grabs things from far away. I had that where I could reach things without getting up. I read books to Ricky. I sang to him. I talked to him. I rubbed my tummy. At night, I would feel his toes just move ever so slightly against my ribs. I stayed calm. I knew I had to try to protect him, right? And I think, all the parents here who are listening, we've all tried to do that, to try to protect and save our children in some way, if it wasn't a sudden loss, if it was a disease or the disease of addiction, anything like that. We've tried to save our children. So I was in that position. I ate well, even though it was hospital food, I ate everything. I actually have over 40 scars on me, on my arms and my hands, very tiny, from all the needles, because they had to continuously put IVs in me. They finally put a port in. So I have all those reminders on my arms and hands. And there was a calendar where I marked off the days because we needed to get to 28 weeks, because 28 weeks is when it's a big marker where if a child, if the gestation goes to that, they have a much better chance in the NICU of them being able to keep them alive. So that was our goal. So every day we, cross off, and every week my partner would bring me a rose every week that we made. So I held on to my faith. I tried to find solace in reading different spiritual and religious books. There was a song called "God Didn't Bring Us This Far to Let Us Down." And so I hung on to those words, right? God didn't bring me this far, because I believed it was part of the whole process with, the whole fertility process and all that to bring me to this point. But at 27 and a half weeks, that was the beginning of the end. In the wee hours of the morning, the nurses came rushing into my room. Apparently, based on the monitors that I was all hooked up to, I had spiked a fever and I had started to have contractions, which I wasn't even feeling. So they came rushing in. This was the second time that I almost died in the process. They attempted a vaginal birth and I began to hemorrhage. So they had to rush me off to have an emergency C-section. And they actually had me awake for a little bit, but as it got closer to where they could see him in the process, they knocked me out because he was completely blue. So I never saw that, fortunately. And so he was rushed to the NICU. Kind of a miracle is that my sister, who happens to be, she's not an amateur photographer, but she loves to take pictures and takes great pictures. She actually had brought her 35 millimeter camera. And she's the one who got, the very first pictures of Ricky once they sort of, cleaned him up and whatnot. And I don't know how well you're going to see this, but this is, I'll just put a warning out there if no one wants to, if you don't want to look at it. He does have an intubation tube in him. But that's Ricky's picture there, my little guy. And he looked like a real baby. I mean, he was he was 2 pounds, 12 ounces, but he was fully formed and everything. So I visited the NICU only for a short time. I had been in bed for 30 days. I couldn't even walk. I had just had surgery and almost hemorrhaged to death. I was in tremendous pain and I was on high-powered medications. So I only got to spend a very short time with him. Then when I was back in bed, again, in the middle of the night, nurses came rushing in and said that I had to sign papers for Ricky to go to CHOP in Philadelphia because he was starting to have a lot of trouble. Signed those papers. And then through the night and the next day, there were phone calls with the doctors. They were doing all kinds of different tests and whatnot. I was stuck in New Jersey in Virtua Hospital, which I'm glad has been knocked down, the old Virtua. And my partner was with him in the NICU at CHOP. So in the phone calls that I got, apparently he had an infection. And that's what started the labor up again. It's a hospital-borne infection. I got it from being in the hospital. Chorioamnionitis, it's called. And so Ricky basically was floating around in contaminated amniotic fluid. So he was very sick. And he had a brain bleed, which most preemies get because, you know, their skull's not formed enough. So one of the peaceful things for me is that my partner was there with him and she sang him every single children's song she knew. And she's a mom of 2 kids, so she knew them all, right? And she sang Happy Birthday to him and Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and, you know, every song you can think of. And that gives me a lot of comfort. Eventually, by around mid-afternoon, I signed myself out of the hospital. I knew I had to go and see him. It was MAA or AMA against medical advice. My doctors didn't want me to go. But I said, Penn Hospital's right next door. If I start having problems, they'll just send me over there. So my father drove me there. I'll never forget. It was a beautiful, beautiful, by the time we got all the paperwork and everything, a beautiful sunset. Never forget it. And at one point, Ricky's numbers began to fall and he was going to code again. And my partner whispered in his ear, Ricky, mommy's coming. Hold on. And his numbers went up.
Isn't that amazing?
So I went and I, of course, was in a wheelchair. And I spent some time with him. And I wanted to touch him, but I didn't want to touch him because you hold on to that hope. You know, all of us parents do. The hope that, you know, maybe he'll get well. So I didn't want to contaminate him. So I didn't touch him too much. But of course, I couldn't hold him either because he was all hooked up to, that's only one tube that you saw. He had many, many tubes in him. But I touched his hair and he actually wrapped his little hand around my finger. I felt that, but I didn't see him move in any other way. So we went to the chapel when the nurses, they kind of had to tend to him, do some things with him. So I went to the chapel and I had no comfort there. It was cold. It was cold temperature and it was cold as in it felt like God wasn't even there. So I went back up to the room and I saw Ricky again. After I had gone, I went to the back room and believe it or not, I pumped because part of that hope again in me, maybe he'll live and I want him to have a mother's milk. My rational brain said he wasn't going to. My emotional brain. And we all know that, everybody who's here. But I went back out and spent a little bit more time with him. And I said to him, Ricky, mommy loves you very much. But if you're too sick and if it's too hard, then you can go. Very difficult for a mother to say. But I knew I had to say those words. So I was in tremendous pain, physical pain. So I went back to lay down. About 15 minutes later, here again, the nurses came rushing in. The nurse said, he's going to code again. What do you want us to do? And I said the 3 hardest words I've ever said in my life. I said, let him go. And so I went out and they unhooked everything and I held him and he died in my arms. I never held him against me. I just wanted to see his face. And I didn't stay very long. In part, again, I was in such tremendous pain. And at this point, emotional pain as well as physical pain. I didn't want to feel him cold. My mother died when I was 24. And by the time we got to the hospital, she was cold. I did not want to feel my baby cold. So after only about 15, 20 minutes, we left. And I can still remember being in the wheelchair, being pushed by the nurse. Everybody was totally silent. And I had no baby in my arms leaving the hospital. In fact, I think there's a book called Empty Arms that's about that. So needless to say, the ride home was, completely torturous. I had never felt physical pain like that, but I'd also never felt emotional pain like that. And I had been through my parents' divorce, my mother's death, my own divorce, and a miscarriage. It was like nothing I've ever known. And as far as all the parents that I've worked with, they've said the same. It's not like any other loss. So we decided the next day to have a funeral, even though Ricky was only lived for 32 and a half hours. His casket, if you know the old styrofoam coolers,
Yes.
that's how big it was. That was hard to take when I walked in there. I collapsed. But then we had a service for him. And a couple days later, I start to have pain in my C-section. I had to go back to the hospital. That was the 3rd time I almost died. I had the same infection Ricky had.
Yeah.
And I had to go back to the same hospital.
And
I had to wait alone in the hallway to go into the ultrasound room. Excruciating. Fortunately, my father came with me. He stayed in the room with me. So there's a lot of trauma, I think, with parents too. I mean, the stories that I've heard from a lot of you that went along with that, finding out that your child has died, if it's a sudden death, or the trauma, by your child's bedside as they're going through chemo treatments, the trauma of maybe even having to Narcan your child. So there's a lot of trauma there. And so, again, no matter where you're, whether it's an infant or, a 30-year-old, or I've worked with women who was a 55-year-old child, right? A lot of shared experiences, right? The agony and the trying to save them and all those common themes. So the grieving and the healing process for me. I used music because I'm a musician. So of course that was very powerful for me. For some people, it's exercise. That's where they do a lot of their grieving and processing. I had a bear that my stepdaughter and her friend had gotten from Build-A-Bear. They had put 2 hearts in it. And they got me that bear for Ricky. before I even was in the hospital. So, of course, Ricky Bear was with me the whole time in the hospital. So,
Sure.
in my mind, of course, he has the spirit of Ricky in him. And my youngest son that I adopted after Ricky, he would hold that bear if he got scared when he was little.
Aw.
I would say, "Your big brother's looking after you. He's your guardian angel. Here, hold Ricky Bear," and he would hold him. He'd fall right back to sleep. So there's the spirit of Ricky in there. Um, Keepsakes, I don't have many, right? I have ultrasound pictures of me pregnant, blanket and a cap, clay molds of his feet and hands that are only about this big, footprints and handprints, a lock of his hair, and pictures of family. I do have pictures of my partner and my stepkids and my dad and stepmom with him in the hospital. For me, it was very short-lived, but there was a time a couple weeks out that I didn't want to live. And I actually had blood pressure type pills for a heart murmur thing that I wasn't taking anymore, but in my cabinet. And I threw them out because I was afraid that I would use them. Again, it was very short-lived because for me, I realized that Ricky fought so hard. For those 30 days, he had that feisty spirit like that ultrasound. And for those 30 days, he grew and grew stronger. He fought hard to live. And who was I to give up the life that I still had? So that was my process. And I try to encourage my clients of that. Your child fought for their life, or they were, enjoying life fully when they had whatever accident they had. Their life got taken from them. It doesn't honor them for us to quit our lives. So for me, I went right into connecting mode with that mothering spirit. I had to do something with it. And so March of Dimes, some of you have heard me talk about that. I became part of their prematurity campaign, an ambassador, spoke for them. And that was really healing for me. So for some parents, doing that and getting involved in something can help your healing. Did a lot of journaling, poetry. I went to support groups, and I was on an online group for a long time. I talked with my mother-in-law. She had pregnancy losses as well, and we would cry at the kitchen table. My motto was, if I can't be happy, I may as well be useful. So I painted my whole house, the inside. And I learned to cook Italian. I learned to cook Italian meatballs with my mother-in-law. I was mad at God for a long time and felt very abandoned. I found my way back, but that's for another podcast at another time about our faith and our loss. The recreating life after loss for me, I began to try again to have another child, but I finally had to let go of that because I probably would have had another loss because of just what was wrong with me anatomically. Also, though, I stayed involved. I kept one foot in life, and I always encourage my clients, you've got to keep a foot in life because eventually joy will come back. And you'll get that spark just for a moment. Then it'll be gone, but then, a spark again, and it eventually the color begins to come back in life. For me, I was able to have another child, but I decided to adopt, and now I have a 17-year-old who today is a senior because he graduated as a junior. So I said, you can now officially be called a senior. So he thinks that's cool. I worked hospice while I was waiting for Will, my youngest, to come home because that was a belabored process, 9 months. And I became, a grief counselor through it. The loss of Ricky changed the whole trajectory of my career and my life, really. So Ricky's been my sidekick. I think he's helped thousands of parents. I'm Batman, he's Robin kind of thing. And so this is kind of the next chapter of his life. He turns 20 today. So part of that next chapter because of that, I got a picture of him made because now we have the technology. For 19 years, I never had a picture of Ricky in my home, only in my bedroom, because of, as you saw, with the tube in his mouth. Because of technology now, Photoshop, I was able to take a picture of me, my newborn picture, that has, they were able to take my lips, because you can't see Ricky's lips because of the tube. And they were able to remove the tape and all that kind of stuff. And so now he just looks like, let's see, a little sleeping baby.
Right.
And so I actually have that picture in my living room now. So he's with the other children's pictures, and it really is. And that's what I mean when I say that the healing continues, that, this healing happened 20 years later in this process. So now I feel like the next chapter for me is, I'm hoping, and Loretta and I are talking about this, to be able to maybe start to be able to coach and teach other practitioners to be able to work with parents the way that I do, even if they haven't lost a child, to get enough understanding from me to be able to do that, because unfortunately there need to be more of me, because unfortunately, children die. That's a reality of life, and parents need support. So that's hopefully the next chapter that will continue on. And that is Ricky's story.
That was amazing, Pat, and thank you for sharing such a personal story. You had a real tough go there. I mean, both physically and emotionally, and thank you for sharing it. And I hope people can gain strength from that. You want to talk about what you learned and what you want to pass on about the uniqueness of a child loss, as opposed to some of the other things that we've been talking about in previous podcasts?
So I call it the 4 Ps. Prepare, plan, protect, and provide. We prepare ourselves for adulthood with kind of this maybe idea out here that, we're going to follow this, the thing where we create our own families. So we're preparing, our whole lives growing up to be adults and continue on to the circle of life, right? We plan. We plan or we don't plan to have children. Some people plan to have children, some people don't. But once that happens, then we protect. As soon as you're pregnant, and sometimes even before that, or if you're adopting, there's a lot of planning and even protecting of the whole process. Now, I've been through both. Of the whole legal process and that you have to go through in order to make an adoption happen. We protect them in the womb, during the adoption practice, in the hospital, like I had to, during cancer treatments, if you have a child with cancer or other types of diseases, buying the safest car, right? If your child has died in an accident, you tried to buy the safest car for them. And we provide for them in so many ways. Our blood, our sweat, our tears, our effort, our sleepless nights, our, working so many hours, going through fertility treatments. When we provide in their basic needs, we provide with their medical treatments that they need. We provide for college, rehab. There's so many ways that we just keep trying to provide for our children. So those are 4 biggies that we don't prepare and plan and protect and provide for our spouses or for our parents. You see what I'm saying? That's pretty unique to when we have a child. So it's so all encompassing And a lot of our meaning and our purpose and our role and our identity is tied up in being a parent. That's another thing that makes it really unique. Then there's the roller coasters of the ups and downs. Let's face it, we might have ups and downs with our spouses, but if we have a halfway decent relationship, we're just like, yeah, whatever, be quiet. I'm gonna go do my thing. You go do your thing. We'll meet when we calm down. It's that sort of thing. But with our children, it sticks to us, right? Each time that we think they're going to be okay. Like if they have cancer treatments and they go into remission, we think they're going to be okay. And then, the cancer shows up again. If they're an addict and in recovery, we think they're going to be okay. And then they relapse. A child is playing or driving and at school, look at Robb Elementary, right? We think they're safe and bam, we get the call that they're not. So that those ups and downs that we're so attached to as parents with our children, that also makes it a very unique loss. It's a love and a joy like nothing else that we've experienced in life. It's so different from other losses because of these factors. And, I'm not saying one is worse than the other, but there's a breadth and a depth of our dedication to our children and our connection to them that is part of the reason why I say to parents, especially new ones, this is going to be, around a 4 or 5 year process because of all the things that we just talked about.
So then what do you want to share about the grieving process with a child, losing a child?
Well, it's obviously, profound, as I just described. And, I often use the metaphor that it doesn't shatter us into pieces, it shatters us into dust. Where we feel like we are so broken, there's not even pieces to put back together. But as I say in an article I wrote a long time ago for Starting Point, that dust is like clay dust. Our tears add water to it. And as you add water to the dust, it starts to form. And like clay. And as we keep molding it, we can actually recreate our lives from that dust. It's important for us to allow ourselves to scream and sob and feel. This is, again, the depth and the breadth. You can't stuff this. You can't go back to work in a week and be okay. It just is not going to happen. It's okay to be mad at God, the universe, nature, at the unfairness of it. It's really important for people to know that they can release that. Know that only other grieving parents will get it. Quite a few of my parents are involved with support groups, and those ladies bond, and sometimes for the rest of their lifetime, because that's very important to have that. It takes time to figure out what to do with the dedication to our child in order to stay connected. Memorial gardens. Sometimes it's public, like with me. Sometimes it's more private, where you donate to certain, causes. Sometimes it's early on, like it was for me. Sometimes people start to do that kind of thing later on. And I'll share much more about this next week when I talk about bringing your child forward and recreating your life.
And that's really part of the healing process, bringing the child forward?
Right. That's what brings us a little bit. Well, I mean, they all commingle to some degree.
Okay.
It can be for me, it was part of the grieving process too, because it happened right away.
Okay.
For others, it's later but it's also part of the healing that we're going to talk about next.
The way you describe the dust, as opposed to pieces,
Mhm.
how do you ever find hope, meaning and purpose again? I mean, it has to be, you talk about the water and the tears and bringing it together, but it just sounds so hard.
And for those who are not criers, I'm a crier, obviously, that, we cry on the inside too. So I don't want to exclude people who don't cry on the outside. It really is important to touch on all of them, to allow yourself to grieve, to be open to that healing, and to move towards the recreating. So part of the healing, it comes from staying connected to our children, and we'll talk more about that next week. Keeping one foot in life, like I had mentioned. Remembering that you are who you've always been. It feels like it has changed us, and it has. But who we are is still there. It's just buried. It's buried under the rubble. And like those pictures that we've all seen of the flower that's coming up out of the concrete, okay, that's us. It can be us. But for a while, we're pretty buried under. But in the healing, we have to remember that we are still who we are, and that we existed before our children did. Like we were a whole person before our children were here. We have to remember that. And I get that they added to our lives, but them having passed doesn't take us away, and it doesn't ruin us. We have to be really careful of saying that the death of my child ruined me or ruined my life, because that would mean that their life, their existence, eventually led to our ruin. And do we really want their lives associated with our ruin? No. And so I encourage people parents to let that sink in. Say, no, that's not how I want my child to be remembered. And that's when they start to say, wait a minute, it's important that I heal. Not just for me, but for my child too. And they start to buy into that. The other thing that can get in the way of healing is the woulda, coulda, shouldas. And so we do work around that to be able to eventually really dampen them, and hopefully get rid of them eventually, because that can really bog us down in the healing process because we don't feel like we're worthy of it. Look, all of us parents, don't we make about 25, 30, 50 decisions a day about our children that we don't know, should we pick A or should we pick B? I mean, every single moment. So we really need to not be so hard on ourselves. The purpose and meaning you asked me about, and that's where joy begins to come into life again. Our child's lives mattered. They continue to matter. Our lives matter. Yeah, we existed before they did. Our lives matter to them still. Our lives matter to the living, the people who are around us. And that's important, again, for us to realize. My sister was just up here from Florida for a couple days. It was a lot of fun. My existence is important to her. If I had taken those pills,
right,
after Ricky, that would have mattered. Okay, so we matter, and with each year, we focus hopefully less on the death of our child and more on the life. I talk to a lot of parents about they start to not really recognize as much the death date, maybe to themselves, but they celebrate more the birth date of their children and the life and tell the stories and that sort of thing. So that's part of that recreating part of our lives. And, I encourage parents with each grief season to listen and learn, because there's something more about yourself, your connection to your child, the profound impact that all of your whole story has had on you that's actually helped you to evolve. So we don't want to shut it down. We don't want to even have it stop. If I would have had it stop, I wouldn't have had that picture of Ricky. You see what I'm saying? I would not have had that picture. 20 years. So we need to continue to breathe life into that relationship, because the connection has a richness to it of their lives and our lives and the other lives that we share with, even though we've had them only for a moment. And that's all I have.
Pat, I cannot thank you enough for sharing this. I hope that everyone listening gets a sense of what an amazing thing you just did for all of us. So thank you. And
I'm sorry. I do want to say about the next
right.
podcast. So I'll be sharing lots of ideas, on how to stay connected to your child and to move forward. I have a lot of ideas from other parents.
Oh, cool.
To share. Yeah. I mean, they give me new ideas all the time. And I will end with that new life can be found on a lake with a ukulele. And you'll have to tune in next week to find out what that means.
I love that, Pat. Great way to end. Well, thank you very much. And we'll be here again next week. So I hope you all can join us. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.